Welcome to Empathy Always Wins, the world's exclusive youth leadership podcast focusing on empathy and wellness. Today, we have a very special guest by the name of Georgina Merhom. Georgina Merhom is a counterterrorism expert. She has previously served as the Director of Counter Terrorism at the G20 Information Centre, leading a group of 40 policy analysts in their research on terrorism and regional security. Georgina holds a BA in Econ and International Relations and a Master of Science in Intelligence and International Security. She currently advises governments, prosecutors, and law enforcement agencies on terrorism cases and threat monitoring. Her days consist of investigating violent extremists and criminal networks on the dark web, tracing underground transactions, serving as an expert witness on terrorism in court, and creating algorithms to forecast threats. I'm extremely proud to call Georgina one of the most empowering and inspiring women youth leaders in the world. So let's dive deep into it. This episode is brought to you by Empowering Media. Empowering Media is a Canadian boutique social media agency delivering results to purpose-driven changemakers and social enterprises in our global community. #Create2Empower to join the movement. Georgina, how are you? Awalan, which means first of all in Arabic. Thank you so much for not only just believing in me and being my number one supporter. Many of our viewers today or listeners don't know a lot about what we're about to talk about because it's a very new topic. When I personally think of counterterrorism, I am not only intrigued, I'm very curious. You work in counterterrorism, and that could come off as scary. How do you explain that to someone on a first date?
So I don't explain it on the first date.
Okay.
I usually just say I work in security, and it just sounds less intense, I think.
So what does that actually mean? Like, what is it that you do on a day-to-day?
So I am a terrorism investigator and a threat forecasting analyst. It's very hard to tell what I do day to day because my days look very different. No 2 days are really the same in my life. And, some days I'm assisting a prosecutor during a trial. Other days I'm on the dark web speaking to terrorists undercover to map out what they're planning and try to prevent an attack. So really, it just differs depending on case and season.
And what type of cases have you dealt with? I find this extremely, I know we've spoken a lot before on a personal level. And for the viewers that really don't know much about how I know Georgina, we actually grew up together, and you can tell them a little bit more about that. But we've known each other since we were 3. And I'm actually very proud of how far I call Georgina Nina, how far Nina has come. And but going back to that question, what cases, actually touch a little bit more on how we know each other, Georgina, before we touch into the types of cases that you've dealt with, because I already know you're fascinating, but they don't know a little bit more about you. So I want you to go in a little bit personal.
So Ali and I actually went to school together. So I went to the same school pretty much my whole life, and Ali grew up in Cairo before he moved to Dubai. So it's Aishra yani. And yeah, I think we reconnected when we both moved to Toronto. We do very different kinds of work, obviously, but I think we always are very intrigued by each other's work and are very supportive of one another. So it's really cool to be kind of interviewed by someone that I know very well on a personal level. And this is my first time experiencing this. So it's really cool.
Thank you. It's actually weird to be professional with someone that I am very personal with usually. Let's hop back into it. So, what cases have you dealt with, Yanina? What are the things that probably I even don't know much about? Feel free to dive as deep as you want.
Yeah, so just a disclaimer before I say anything. If I ever decide to comment on a case publicly, it means that it's already gone through law enforcement, court cycles, and whatnot. I would never speak about an ongoing case. So if anyone's listening to this and kind of freaking out that I'm disclosing so much, don't worry. This is also in the press, okay?
Perfect.
So that being
Thank you for
said,
that.
one recent case that I was working on was, we were using software and decryption tools to geolocate the server of a young professional living in North America who created a do-it-yourself how to make explosives in your kitchen video. And he posted it to an ISIS group chat on the dark web, essentially encouraging people to create explosives in their homes and bomb areas of their country. So this is a really good example of how terrorism has evolved and is now being decentralized, because essentially anyone can do it anywhere. We don't really have the same model of the dude with the Kalashnikov or with a big weapon on the border. It could be anyone, and it makes it a lot harder to regulate and control. Another case I recently worked on was collecting evidence against a company that was financing a terror operation abroad through seemingly very legitimate business activities. They were paying taxes as usual. They looked like a very regular company, but you dig deeper and you find a web of transactions that connect to other parts of the world, and essentially that went to court, and that person is now in jail. So so that's kind of like the cases that I work on when it comes to threat forecasting.
And how old are you? Sorry. How old are you? Sorry.
I'm 22.
Okay. Holy shit. That's impressive. Okay. Yalla.
So when it comes to threat forecasting, what I do is very different. So forecasting is about quantifying trends and patterns so that we can predict future threats. And it's very similar in technique to how economists can predict growth, recession, and economic activity. And that's where my quantitative background comes in. So for one of my government clients, I recently dug up decades of data on every known domestic attack that has happened, to create an algorithm that then has helped predict the likelihood of a dormant terrorist cell becoming active in any village of that country. So that's another example of how we can use models and economics actually to predict future threats.
Yeah, I know you have an economics degree, so that's probably ties in with it. It connects with what you're doing right now, because I know many of our listeners don't know that you've graduated from the University of Toronto with an economics degree. Can you talk a little bit more about your master's?
Yeah, so my master's was in intelligence and international security, and I've always kind of been curious about security, but it wasn't until I kind of accidentally started a terrorism investigation that I decided to pursue it on a professional level.
Just wait 1 second. How did you accidentally stumble upon a terrorism investigation? Look, I'm sorry to anyone else that may not have found this a little bit just fascinating. One does not simply just stumble upon an accidental terrorism investigation, but you can go for it. And I'm sorry for
I'm a bit of a troublemaker. I've always been that curious child that just chases after whatever I actually find curious. So if I see danger, I usually don't look the other way. I usually just dive head first and see what happens, which my parents have had to suffer through. So I actually did a full 7-minute podcast on how this came about and how my first investigation came about while in university. So maybe we can link it in your show notes.
Yeah, we'll link
or
it
something.
For sure. I do have the SoundCloud link for sure.
Just to cut it short, I was a 17-year-old university student living in Toronto when I came across an advertisement for a charity event raising funds for children in war zones. And it was essentially a cover for a terrorism financing operation that was taking place all over North America. But we didn't find this out until 3 years later. So at 17 years old, I go to this event. I feel instantly and like unexplainably unsafe being a Coptic Christian. It was a very familiar feeling to me, having lived in Egypt under the governance of jihadist group in 2013 when the Muslim Brotherhood was governing the country. And so they asked me what my name was when I walked in, and I immediately hid my cross into my sweater, and I said my name was Zainab. And it was just like complete at a snap of a finger, didn't even think about it. It was kind of like an instinctual reaction. I didn't want to tell them my real name because it would have been indicative of my religious background. And I've done this quite often in Egypt, actually, where I'll walk into some place that I just know there's some sort of religious supremacy. And this happened more so when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power. But I just would say that my name was Jomena or something like, like,
no, it's a serious issue. And it's something, prejudice can sometimes be and that's probably what we're going to be diving deep into. And, it's understanding and empathy, which is the theme of this show. Empathy always wins. So just to go a little bit, dive in a little bit deeper. You mentioned instinct is what led you to investigate that nonprofit. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how have you always been that girl that goes with her instinct? Like, how can someone follow that? Because I think me and you are type of people that really sort of follow their gut with a lot of things. But I'd like to know a little bit more about how perhaps you go on about it, because your career depends on it.
Yeah. So when I was younger, I actually was naturally very calculated and strategic in my decision making. I used to be the kind of person that made pros and cons list, literally weighted in percentage by level of importance for everything in my life, whether I should break up with a boyfriend to what university I should go to. It was quite obsessive, and I had unhealthy habits of reducing everything to an equation, and that I think affected every aspect of my life, beginning with my faith and ending in my relationships and anxiety. I think since then, and I think I owe a lot to it, to my job, actually, I've grown a lot personally, and I've learned to rely a lot more on my instinct as well as my faith. So in counterterrorism, those equations and pros and cons list and all of that stuff barely ever works, because part of being strategic is being adaptive and flexible in order to successfully navigate the unknowns. So when I first started my investigation, I was operating on sheer gut, right? And maybe a little bit of recklessness. So I think, how this was explained to me later on when I actually did end up, making a career out of it and getting trained, was that our evolutionary instincts developed over time to help us survive. And that's something that everyone has. It's not something that only counterterrorism professionals have. It's just knowing how to unlock it. And the simplest example is our ability to identify and evade a predator. When you sense that something is dangerous, usually it is. And that's a very important skill to hone, because instinct is scientific. It draws on a lifetime of accumulated experiences that are quietly stashed in our subconscious and then broken down into chunks over time. And, you could be busy living your own life, and those experiences begin to repeat themselves in the forms of patterns. And those patterns then become sort of like algorithms in your subconscious, where your instinct can search and draw conclusions from, algorithms that your conscious mind might not even have access to. Your conscious mind not even know that those kinds of data patterns exist. Yeah. So going back to this investigation, if I had created a pros and cons list instead of just operating on instinct, my life would have probably taken a very different turn. There are too many data points of experiences for my conscious mind to have processed in that minute where I made the decision to even say that my name was Zainab and accidentally end up going undercover when I was really just protecting myself. And that's where I think my subconscious mind proved to me that it was a lot smarter than my conscious mind, or at least smarter than mine was on that day.
And Yani, I just got off a call, actually, off a podcast episode with Tanvir Nasir. He's an award-winning leadership writer and author. He was telling me a little bit more on how it's actually, how we are hardwired for these subconscious feelings, and neural pathways in our brains actually are there to help serve that fight or flight response. And people that sort of put a blind eye on their emotions and on events in life are often at a disadvantage, because as kids we were very sensitive and we're very emotional, and we have a deep understanding of one another. And as we grow up, with cultural biases, with the jam, as we grow up, we start to develop our own mental models of the world. Sometimes we lose that sort of empathetic, we call it emotional intelligence, that skill which can be built and rebuilt again, which is essentially what you were talking about when you walked into that room and you said your name was Zainab, right? Mm-hmm. You felt afraid because you were in tune with that emotion, whereas I think that this is an emotional response that, for many, it comes natural, but I do believe that you can train that. And that brings me to my next question. The average listener won't use their instincts to detect threats like you do, to stop terrorism. What advice would you give people in general who want to start relying more on their instinct to make business or personal decisions that can benefit their quality of life and even further them in their career?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because I've since also started relying more on my instinct for my own personal life outside of counterterrorism. Awesome. I think that for me, so I struggle with anxiety, and my anxiety has gotten heightened since taking on specific cases. I struggled with some sleep paralysis after doing one specific case that was honestly traumatizing. And I remember talking to my boss, and there was one day specifically where I was telling him, I think my instincts are telling me that we should go this direction. And then he asked me, like, are you sure that's instinct or is that anxiety? And he was right. So I think that what he was trying to tell me was, your instinct can only perform as well as your self-awareness allows it to. And by that, I mean, for your instinct to work the way it should, you really need to be able to differentiate the different voices in your head. And for that, you need to have a lot of mental strength. That doesn't mean you need to be clear of all mental illness. It just means you need to be aware of it. So for me, I've learned that my anxiety, I was talking to a friend 2 days ago, and I was trying to explain this to her because she also was trying to justify her actions by saying it's my gut. And I was telling her, no, this isn't your gut. I think this is your anxiety. And for me, the way I kind of picture it is my anxiety. That video of Kanye West in the White House talking to Donald Trump, where he literally is not breathing and he's just like, and he's just speaking so loud and frantic. Yeah. To me, that's what my anxiety sounds like. And then my instinct or my intuition is powerful and wise and calm and anchoring. And it kind of sounds like Oprah. That's how I can explain it in the simplest of terms.
So fear versus empowerment, right? That's how So fear versus empowerment, right? One gets you to act from from a state of fear versus one gets you to act and feel empowered. Is that how you would clarify it?
I think so. I think sometimes, it empowers you by giving you signals. So sometimes that signal could be a flight or fight response. Sometimes that signal is to go for something, and I think the only way to really unlock the potential of your intuition is to become self-aware and to really know yourself and know what your anxiety sounds like and know what triggers it, but then also know what your intuition sounds like. Be their friend, make your intuition your best friend, because essentially once you move past those hurdles, your instinct is your guardian angel and can be a very useful tool in work, life, relationships. It can, for me, it could be the difference between unlocking a source that will stop a bomb and not doing that. So for me, the consequences are quite large. And for people working in security, the consequences are quite large. But I think it also applies to day-to-day life. Yeah.
First of all, I want to say thank you for sharing the fact that, you experience and you struggled sometimes from anxiety, because it's brave to go on public record and disclose that. Second of all, I want to go in a little bit deeper and dive into the statement "empathy always wins." How do you incorporate that in your field of work? And do you agree with that statement? Can empathy win you cases? Can your display of empathy allow you to I wouldn't say crack a terrorist, but pass through a barrier that otherwise wouldn't have been passed?
Yes and no. So when I worked in global governance, I was always told that empathy was the most important part of a peace negotiation. But a negotiation can only be successful if peace is what both sides want. It doesn't work when one side wants to win. In the case of terrorism, jihadists are not fighting for peace, they're fighting to win. And at that point, the alternative is to fight back strategically. So in that case, empathy can have a place. And I don't mean it in a way where we're going to be apologists to terrorists, because that's extremely dangerous. But what I mean by that is it can help us really understand what we're fighting. It can help us deconstruct what their motives are, what their triggers are, what their vulnerabilities are. It can be very scary to look someone in the eye who's killed thousands of people and try to see humanity in them. And it's so much easier to reduce our adversaries to one-dimensional binary things. But for the last few decades, we've been treating terrorists like this one size fits all, where someone, is wearing a certain clothing and is carrying a weapon and looks a certain way and has a beard. And where has that gotten us, really? Because, they've outsmarted us because they've taken on different forms, and we've been too scared to approach that, to understand what goes on behind all of that, behind the facade. Terrorism has actually, since the formation of the G7 in 1973, terrorism has increased by 5,000%, and no one is talking about it. Wow. No one is talking about how the strategy we've been using for the last how many decades has just not worked. So I think, we have to stop being so reactive and start being proactive. And to do that, we have to dig deeper. When you dig deeper, you have access to very interesting data points, things like, like the percentage beneath livable wage that a border guard gets paid, and therefore the potential for them receiving a bribe. And having a terrorist cross illegally, that's a very important data point that you would not get. We don't get those data points from looking at someone as a one-dimensional thing. We actually end up losing, and they end up outsmarting us. So in this case, empathy doesn't mean that you agree with someone or that you justify their actions. It just means that you can put yourself in their shoes and understand what drove them from point A to B, and that's data. So it doesn't have to be this self-sacrificial act of feeling sorry for someone. It can actually be self-serving. And, if you understand your enemy, you're one step ahead. You're not reactive, you're proactive. You don't win a war by making rash, reactive decisions. You win a war by being strategic and proactive. And you cannot do that without crucial data points like the things we just discussed. And you can't access those crucial data points without leveraging vulnerability. So I'm just going to leave you guys with like one thing, and that is war is strategy and empathy is data. So whether your adversary is...
I love that.
Whether your adversary is someone that you're trying to negotiate a business deal with and you're trying to win that negotiation, whether it is, an argument that you're having with a partner, I think don't leverage on a partner. I have. It just does not go well. But I think it applies to everything. War is strategy and empathy is data. So
I think that goes in the books for sure. That goes in the books for sure. I know your job is very demanding. How do you manage your own mental health after seeing so much darkness? Because first of all, you did mention that your job requires you to look into the eyes of people that have killed thousands. And have you done that?
Yeah, I have.
Fuck. So how do you manage being the strong Nina that I know?
Well, okay. So first off, my job contract says I need to get a psychiatric analysis every 45 days. So I should probably mention that. But I'm not like doing this on my own. I think I have a lot of resources to help me manage whatever it is that I'm exposed to and the traumas that I see on a daily basis. I think actually this kind of forced me into a corner to start taking care of myself, because a huge part of my job is being very self-aware and being very mentally strong. And once that suffers, your investigations start becoming inaccurate and the consequences are pretty large, like I discussed. So I think that doesn't just apply to mental health, but it also applies to even my discrepancies in my character that maybe are actually holding me back. For me, I think anxiety is one of them, and being unable sometimes to I conflate my anxiety and my intuition quite a lot. That's the first one. The second area where I kind of lack is confirmation bias. And that comes, I think, from, I'm a very proud Egyptian. I will defend my country till death.
Hey,
you know what? And that's great. And I have so much respect for everyone that does things out of love for their country. But I think that when you're dealing with international investigations, you kind of have to check yourself and check your confirmation bias, so that your investigations still maintain the level of integrity that they should. So I think you have to just be aware of your mental health and really prioritize that. When I was in university, I really did not. I went to the University of Toronto, where drug usage is like the highest in North America. Everyone's on Adderall. People are expected to graduate with 4.0 plus, however many years of experience magically. It's an extremely competitive university. And in the last year, there's been 7 to 8 suicides just on campus. So when I was in university, this was not cool. Like, prioritizing your mental health was not a thing at all. But now that it's actually in my contract that I have to take care of myself. So I actually think it's oddly helped make me, I think I've developed a lot as a person because of it.
Yeah, I mean, talking about UFT, Rotman just had a conference on mental health, and it was the biggest conference. They brought in all the executives of all companies to implement more awareness and initiatives, because they realized that the problem is getting out of hand. But going back to that point, do you get nightmares or panic attacks, or do these things come in do these things pop into in your sleep? Because I can't imagine doing what you're doing personally, and I don't think that's a skill set that anyone can just have overnight and develop the level of emotional strength that you have.
I really appreciate that. I think that for me, I find strength in places that I didn't think I could. I've had to rely on my faith a lot, which I never did. I struggled with my faith my entire life. And it wasn't until I was in very scary situations that that was my last resort. And I also think, I do. If you're asking if I get nightmares, I do. Yeah. Actually, since I've always struggled with anxiety, but I think it's kind of manifested in the form of sleep paralysis lately, where not to give too much detail, but I live by myself in New York, and I will get sometimes these episodes in my sleep where I'm half awake but half asleep, and I can hear someone calling for me in the hallway, and I think it's Al-Qaeda trying to abduct me or something. So I do get nightmares like that. I think everyone does. It's very hard to desensitize when you're watching some very scary stuff all day. There's a lot of torture videos or beheading videos that I have to watch on a daily basis to try to locate where they are. So, watching that and having to take notes, or speaking to a convicted terrorist, or speaking to someone and questioning them over evidence, if they have been involved in a terrorism operation, it's definitely not an easy job emotionally, but I think that for me, I do it out of love. And I've also learned that courage comes in so many different forms. My mother cannot sit through a full horror movie, but I know that in a heartbeat, she would take a bullet to protect my sisters and I. And I think at the core, that's where courage stems from. I'm not this superhero. There are so many people more brave than I am. There are journalists on the ground. There are people in law enforcement that have to dismantle bombs by hand. There are people that are getting tortured and raped by terrorists. So really, I'm not that great. But I think my courage stems from love, whether it's love for others or love for my country or love for God. I think that with my line of work too, like I said, you have to be a bit of a troublemaker. So let me rephrase that. Courage is a lot of love and a little bit of trouble.
That's another one for the books, huh? That's another one for the book. And just for the record, you are great. Everyone is great in their own way. I do not ever want to. I don't like it when people, and not to put you on the spot here, but I think everyone's doing an important job in their own way, shape, or form. So again, I just want to thank you again for being so vulnerable. We haven't finished yet, but you have been so vulnerable in that last 10 minutes. And I want to thank you, because it takes a lot of courage and a lot within someone to come out and say this on public record. And I think this is probably what I'm going to be doing with all the guests that come on, because I think that vulnerability is core strength, is at its core strength. With that being said, has your job made you a little bit cold or emotionally disconnected, having seen and gone through all these experiences?
I don't think so. I think at times you do have to shut things off, just in order to get through the day and check things off your to-do list. But I also think that there are times where it does just get to you, and it's hard not to. And maybe I'm still at the very early stages of my career, so I might, maybe in 10 years we'll talk and I will be completely desensitized. But I think it's hard to watch people butcher each other and not feel anything. I think I'd be lying if I said that. But then, at the same time, I think that when it does happen, when it does tear you apart, which it does, and I see my boss who's been doing this for 30 plus years, there are days where it will get to you. And I think when that does happen, you can't you can't take the road of avoidance. You have to tap into it, and you have to tap into that vulnerability. And first of all, it gives you purpose. Second of all, that vulnerability acts as kind of like a gap filler in data points that you can't get just from research and just from talking to people.
That gut instinct that we were talking about, right?
Exactly. And you have to be willing to tap into that power, because it is power. It's just a lot. It takes a lot of bravery to do that. I think the cowardly thing to do is just look the other way and pretend it's not getting to you. But that's when we end up getting gaps in data points, and when we end up losing the fight, essentially.
Okay, so with that being said, do you think that we should be shooting terrorists at the border?
Absolutely, yes. When I said that strategy has not been working, what I meant by that was there's two parts to it. So the first part is when we're looking at a terrorism operation and we're evaluating it, let's evaluate it quantitatively. You have 80% of resources and of human resources, money and people. 80% of that is being expended on everything before it gets to a military base. What I mean by that is there's financing operations, there's recruitment, there's army training, there is, weapon creation. There's support from different entities, from the private sector. That is 80% of the operation. So if we're only focusing on 20% of it, which is the military aspect, which is still very important. And by the way, people fighting on the ground are the bravest people I've ever met. And I have so much respect for them. When you talk about courage, those are the people with courage out of love for their country. So when I talk about that strategy not working, I mean, it's simply because 80% of their operation happens before. We only start reacting when it gets to a military base, which is where we fall short. The second aspect is a bit more technical from a war strategy, military point of view. And it's that, terrorism has been around for 100 years, but really Egypt was actually the only country to deal with it for that long, because we had that terrorism started with the Muslim Brotherhood 100 years back. It really only started affecting the West, decades after. So what I mean by also a military, from a military standpoint, militaries don't have that much experience fighting terrorism. They have experiences fighting other militaries, and that's a very different technique when you're comparing the two, because insurgencies and terrorism, they fight differently, and therefore your defense has to be different. And that's not a shortcoming from any side. It's simply a lack of experience. And I think that's why the Egyptian military specifically, because it's been around for the longest, and has had the most experience fighting terrorism insurgency, has kind of been a leader in counterterrorism globally. So when I talk about that strategy not working, it's because of two things. The first part being that the majority of the operation doesn't even happen at a military base. And the second part being, in general, historically, we actually don't have much experience to draw from fighting insurgency.
That makes a whole lot more sense. Do you think being a woman puts you in a disadvantage working in security?
Yes and no. Yes, in terms of, this idea of having women in security is quite new. So therefore, people are less likely to take a risk on you. And it also just sounds very weird to people that aren't in the field when you introduce yourself as someone working in security. I would have loved to be in the army, but that doesn't look like a possibility. So in some ways, I'm like, see, you laughed. When I first said that, I think everyone thought I was joking, but I truly, truly would love to. So if anyone can make that happen, call me. I think that's like the downside of it. But at the same time, I do think there's a reason that there's both men and women on this planet, and there's a mix of masculine and feminine energy inside of us. So I think my female energy is actually an advantage for me and my team, because I'm very attuned to emotional intelligence, which is stereotypically a feminine quality, and that women's intuition, the intuition that, God gave women to protect their offspring, is biologically proven. And I think that also has helped me judge situations more accurately and more intuitively than my male coworkers sometimes. When we talk about security and counterterrorism, I think those are very important skills where we need more women so that we can contribute that different perspective. We're now over 15 years into a conflict, this war on terrorism, that has been waged and executed primarily by men on both sides. So I think, if we want things to change, we do need to involve women, because they offer a different skill set, and you don't have to be the same to be equal. I think we need to embrace our differences so that we can add different perspectives to the solution.
That actually is a great segue to this next question that I have for you, which is: has there ever been a time where you've ever felt the need to embody a little bit of a more masculine type of energy working in security?
I think so. I think when you're younger, and especially, the first time I ever sat at a table where it was all men, which happens quite often in my field, I found myself trying to mimic the people around me. And I think that can be, happening in any field, like whether you're in security or sometimes in finance. I hear my friends talking about it. I think when you're young, you learn from whoever's around. And if everyone around you is a man and they have quite high masculine energy, you think that that's the only way to be successful at your job. But what I found was that by actually embracing my feminine qualities, my skills of compassionate engagement, my ability to really climb into someone else's perspective, my ability to get a source to trust me and charm my way into getting access to things that usually other people wouldn't. So I started seeing those things as superpowers, as opposed to something that is weighing me down and something that I need to hide or not embrace. So I think that actually by embracing my feminine superpowers, I became a lot better at my job. But definitely at first, I think it's very tempting to just mimic everyone around you.
Yeah, and I think a lot more women have to really consider what you've just said right now, especially in any field or in any career, right? Especially with 80% of leadership roles being filled by men. How do we balance that gap and make sure that it happens in the best way possible? And I think that was a great question. But leading on from there, what do you think of female leaders in your field? Is there anything you'd like to? Is there something you'd like to put out there for women leaders in security?
Well, to be quite frank, we don't really have much data to draw on, because, like you said, we haven't seen much female leadership at the very high level of governance or of security for that long. So there's not enough data to draw from to even see what that would be like. But one case that sticks out to me the most is Rwanda. So Rwanda is it's the only female majority legislature in the world. And we're now 20 years past the genocide, which killed 1 million people in 100 days. And for a country so small like Rwanda, that's 1 out of 10 citizens. So because of their female leadership there, they've created a program that when I first heard of, to me sounded absolutely absurd, but the results kind of speak for themselves. So essentially their program is that each victim family, so for example, if I had someone in my family get killed by someone in yours, God forbid, but let's just pretend, you and I would have to have a conversation that sometimes lasts over a year, where the closest living relatives of the victim speak to the closest living relatives of the killer, and they've been able to create this, channel for forgiveness that we've really never seen before, on such a large scale. And this ability to move beyond trauma has led to now Rwanda being one of the highest growing economies in Africa. So they've actually, the results show, at least from a numbers point of view, that they've been very successful in putting that trauma behind them. And I think that was because of the female leadership. I think,
wow.
When I was younger, going back to something very small scaled, if my sister and I would ever get into arguments, my mom would always kind of create this environment where it felt like court a little bit, where we'd both say our sides, and we'd find common ground and whatnot. And I really think that is a traditionally feminine style of leadership. You're hearing both sides out. You're really trying to connect on a human level of forgiveness and compassion. And, that might sound very idealistic. To be honest, to me, it does. And I still think it's completely absurd, but it seems to have worked. So I think that's an example.
Wow. That is, when we spoke about this just before we hopped on the show, it still, like, even as you say it again, it still fascinates me every single time I hear that, because we are in need for more women in leadership position roles. I advocate for that. I try my best to really speak on that, on their, I don't want to ever say on their behalf, but until we have way more women talking, I think men also need to play a role to enable and enforce that. So again, I just want to say that was a great answer, and that, to say the least, it was empowering. So Nina, right now, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be heading into the fun part of the podcast, Empathy Always Wins. I really want to dig deeper, and I feel like you're one of the most fascinating people that I personally know. This segment is called the Fireball segment. So are you ready?
I think so.
All right. Give me 1 second. Let me just put my timer on. And we have 1 minute. Okay, let's go. What's your biggest fear?
Conforming or not being free.
What's your favorite color?
Pink.
What's your favorite sports person?
I'll say Mohammed Salah just because he's Egyptian.
Okay. What's your proudest achievement?
I think writing my thesis, my first investigation, aka.
Favorite motivational speaker?
Ooh, I don't think I have one.
What about your
I don't
favorite
listen
book?
to enough motivational speeches. I should.
What about your favorite book?
I have a few, but The Art of War is my favorite right now.
If you could relive one day again, what would it be?
I don't know. Sorry.
Favorite food?
Popcorn with black truffle salt.
Money or fame?
Money.
Number one thing that annoys you?
When people cannot see two sides of something and are too stubborn, because I think it's the number one trait of a narcissist.
The number one song that best describes your life? You have 10 seconds.
Sorry. I can't think at the top of my head. Hot and Dangerous, is that a song? No, that's... Do you know that song by Katy Perry where she says hot and dangerous? Yeah, that one. Dangerous, if that's a song.
Dangerous, okay. That was quite intense. I could tell that you were steaming up, which is a good thing because That's one thing me and you know very well, that we need to tap into that, right? We need to tap
Yeah, I
into
guess.
part of ourselves. Okay, so moving on from that part of our podcast, that segment, actually shout out to Aaron, because I was inspired to include that fun part of the podcast after going on his podcast, which, you're in always constant state of learning. So shout out to Aaron, Find Your Voice podcast. I think it's one of the best.
Thank you, Aaron. That was fun.
Yeah. So we're going to head into the next part right now. So I'm going to ask you,
Wow.
we have two more parts. So right now, I know that part of our growth is built on self-reflection. So I'm going to ask you one question, and hopefully by sharing the answer with our viewers and listeners today, they could take one thing out of your life to sort of implement into their own life. So if you could go back in time to the younger Nina, to the younger Georgina, what's one thing you would tell her that you would do differently?
Don't trust girls outside of your bloodline. Actually, I'm joking.
Okay.
Kind of. Put that aside, like kind of joking, kind of not. But seriously, something I would tell my younger self is you can be right or you can be happy. And what I mean by that is, for me, I've always been a very firm, confrontational person. For better or for worse, I think it's my best and worst quality, but it can be very toxic if every time you go into an argument with someone, your mentality is, I have to prove this person wrong, instead of just actually going in with an open mind and saying, what can I learn from this conversation? It's okay to admit that maybe, you reached a conclusion that was based off of some sort of bias or inaccurate information. It's okay to change your mind. That's how you grow and evolve and better yourself. So I think the bigger thing is, like, just stop trying to prove people wrong and instead try to make them more, because the biggest thing you can get out of going into an argument with someone that carries different beliefs than you is it should be based on this desire to expand your worldview and not based on a desire to win an argument. The chances are the other person also thinks that they're the good guy or that they're right and that they're very logical. So, you win nothing out of the situation by proving that you're right. You don't end up curing cancer. You don't end up finding a solution. And it's also important to identify when the other person is just trying to win. And if that's their goal, let them, be able to also identify that desire to win in yourself. It's so important to be self-aware, because at the end of the day, diversity in thought is such a great thing. We should embrace it. And I think if we all spend more time expanding how we think instead of proving points to each other, we'd live in a much more collaborative, productive, and solution-oriented world, I think.
So that's amazing. And I totally agree with that. But to a 15-year-old Nina, how would you simplify all that in one sentence?
You can be right or you can be happy.
Perfect.
Yeah.
The next segment is it's actually gonna be one question, and it's gonna be revolved around legacy. You are someone, again, that's doing something that many Middle Eastern women and men dare not to do, especially in the US, work in counterterrorism, which to me is extremely impressive. But tapping into your legacy, what would be the title of the book that you would write 100 years from now? If there was a title on a book written by you, what would it be? And what would be written on the back matter of the book?
Is it supposed to be a funny question, or do you want a serious answer?
You know what? I'm not cutting that out. I'm putting that in the podcast. I want that to be whatever you would make it to be.
I think confronting terror or My friend introduces me to other people as, this is Georgina, she's a terrorist hunter, which is the funniest thing ever. But I think, confronting is not something that is happening a lot in counterterrorism. I think what people are doing instead is treating it like purely a military matter, where you're just fighting on a military basis. But this war on terrorism has been going on for so long now, and I think really the only way to do it is to confront, and that requires a lot more than a military response. It requires a legal response. It requires an educational response. It requires a policy response. It requires confrontation between governments that might be actually supporting some of those activities. So it really is about confronting that underground economy as a whole and treating it as a holistic thing. And I think such a big part of who I am is a confrontational, slightly controversial person. And I think that's why I'm not too scared of asking those questions.
So with all that being said, what would the title be?
Confronting terror, I think.
That's it. You've got it. You've absolutely nailed it. Again, I'd like to say thank you so much, Georgina, for not only being our first guest on Empathy Always Wins, but really putting yourself out there and showing the world that vulnerability at its core is true strength. I'd also love to thank all our listeners, yes, you guys, because if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be excited to bring guests that inspire, empower, and have purpose-driven missions to create a change for our future. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, just remember, in life and in business, empathy always wins.